Didn't do that. Really? Yeah. And especially the first name. Yeah. Because most Americans don't even know Allard. You get Allard. So that's really good. But sometimes you get nervous at that.
Oh, no worries. I've made that mistake enough times. I pay attention for it. I just hope I don't make it.
No, but I think no American has approached it so closely. Yeah, oh my gosh, you should really. So,
Wow.
Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, no, we just need to use this mic.
Okay, great. Yeah.
All right. Can everyone hear me okay? How about now?
We can still hear you.
You can still hear me? I just speak very softly. And my son did the AV check a few minutes ago. So, Thaddeus, are we running on FaceTime yet?
You're good. You're rolling.
Awesome. I mean, Facebook. So, I'm just here to very briefly introduce Allard den Dulk. Did I get it right? Close. As close as an American can get. But very importantly, I wanted to point out that Allard is planning a DFW conference in Amsterdam for 2021. So we want to start getting that word out there because Amsterdam is an amazing city, and I have a feeling that will be an amazing conference. So without further ado, let me introduce our keynote. Thank you, Ryan, and thank you for inviting me to give this keynote. Good morning, everybody. The paper I'd like to present to you is part of my current research project called Wallace's Existentialist Intertext, Comparative Readings with the Fiction of Kafka, Dostoevsky, Camus, and Sartre, for which I did research at the Ransom Center's David Foster Wallace archive. My paper today offers the first outlines for comparative reading of two short stories from Wallace's brief interviews with hideous men, namely The Depressed Person and brief interview number 20, which I deem to be companion pieces, with respectively part 1 and part 2 of Dostoevsky's Note from Underground. Now, Wallace's admiration of Dostoevsky is well known. He expressed it most clearly in his 1996 review of Joseph Frank's biography of the Russian novelist. It is relevant to note that, making extensive notes and heavily annotating the different volumes of Frank's biography, Wallace worked on this review throughout 1995, and the review then came out in April 1996. Wallace likely worked on brief interview number 20 in the following 1996-1997 period. No early drafts are available at the Ransom Center, but the final revised version submitted to the Paris Review for publication is dated 1 September 1997, and the story then appeared in the fall 1997 issue. The Depressed Person seems to have been conceived around that time. The Ransom Center's folder of handwritten notes and first typescripts of the story is dated June-October 1997, and the story was published in Harper's Magazine in January 1998. I'm not so much interested as my end goal in proving the influence of Dostoevsky on Wallace. While anchored in careful attention to the text and the underlying archival materials, the readings offered here are inherently speculative. My paper aims, through comparative close reading, tracing shared themes, motifs, and formal traits, to enrich our understanding of these texts and of Wallace's literary project as both formally innovative and driven by traditional moral themes such as virtue, empathy, and selfhood, by identifying and analyzing its connections to Dostoevsky. So here's the structure of my talk. I will first briefly address the existing scholarship on the two stories from brief interviews that I'll be focusing on, and then say something very generally about the connection between Wallace and Dostoevsky, and subsequently my successive comparative readings of The Depressed Person with part 1 of notes and brief interview number 20 with part 2, throughout which hyperreflexivity, skepticism, wickedness, and empathy will be recurring themes. I'll be quoting from the stories and from the archival materials throughout. I have the quotations up on the slide, so that's what I'm using the PowerPoint for, and also so that I don't have to do the quote-unquote stuff all the time. You'll see that sort of appearing on the screen beside me. The screen is doing the quote-unquote for me. Okay, here we go. So Mary Kay Holland has provided the most insightful and comprehensive reading of brief interviews with hideous men to date. She characterized the collection as an unflinching critique of narcissism as an impediment to empathy and sincerity. However, Holland contends that the collection ultimately cannot illuminate how to move beyond this narcissism because of what she calls always elusive post-structural language. According to Holland, the depressed person asks, rather than elucidates, how we are to escape narcissism all through language. And brief interview number 20 suggests the impossibility of ever wholly transcending either the narcissistic self or language. She concludes that the collection seems to imply that it and we cannot escape the suffocating and distorting conditions of language, trapped in a discursive loop, offering only a few discrete moments in which the reader can understand, even participate in, acts of empathy. Other scholars like Marshall Boswell and Christoforos Diakoulakis have drawn similar conclusions about the stories in Brief Interviews with Hideous Men, confirming a supposedly inescapable failure of language. I disagree with such interpretations, and I think a comparative reading of The Depressed Person and Brief Interview number 20 with Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground can show us, first of all, that such a view of language as doomed to fail is in fact part of and conducive to the exacerbation of narcissism, and secondly, that these texts do clearly circumscribe a space beyond this trap. To date, the question of how... a little bit of feedback. To date, the question of how Wallace's work was informed by that of Dostoevsky has been addressed by two insightful comparative studies by Timothy Jacobs and Lucas Thompson. However, due to the broad scope of their projects, Jacob and Thompson offer little sustained comparative interpretation of how such connections to Dostoevsky might guide our understanding of specific Wallace texts. There seem to have been two main aspects of Dostoevsky's work that inspired Wallace. Firstly, Dostoevsky's analysis of the societal problems of his time and the required alternative. Secondly, Dostoevsky's ability to cast these theoretical ideas into his fiction and still create stories and characters that are real, human, lifelike. To start with the first aspect, Dostoevsky's interpretation of his cultural context influenced Wallace's understanding of his own culture in Diagnosis as well as Cure. I think this is where we're supposed to be. In his review of Frank's biography, Wallace contends that Dostoevsky's novels are important to us as readers in 1996 America. For example, because of how Dostoevsky's critique of nihilism might encourage us to consider in what way we might be under our own type of nihilist spell. As to the second aspect, Wallace admires perhaps even more Dostoevsky's ability to cast these philosophical analyses into fiction that is human and alive. As Wallace writes in his notes, theoretical agenda with living characters. His review elaborates this observation by explicitly holding up Dostoevsky as a model for writing morally passionately moral fiction that is also ingenious and radiantly human fiction. Let me now start taking a closer look at the texts themselves, starting with The Depressed Person and Part 1 of Notes from Underground. Wallace seems to have been especially struck by the idea and the potential of the underground man as a character who is explicitly presented as a type, that is, as a figure who embodies certain cultural phenomena. In his copy of Notes from Underground, Wallace underlines the footnote Dostoevsky places on the first page of the novella. It reads, "It is clear that such persons as the writer of these notes not only may, but positively must exist in our society when we consider the circumstances in the midst of which our society is formed." The notion of a main character embodying a type that must exist clearly applies to the depressed person as well. The story, because of its title and eponymous nameless main character, demands to be read not just as a portrayal of deep psychological despair, but as the diagnosis of a type that is bound up with our specific time. Also note the similar nameless generality of the descriptor used to identify these two protagonists, the underground man, the depressed person. Their generalized names make clear that these characters partly function as parodic caricature, to use Wallace's own description of the underground man, a characterization he had again gleaned from Frank's biography. But as we have seen, Wallace praises Dostoevsky exactly for his ability to combine such a theoretical agenda with living characters. In his notes for the review, Wallace identifies Notes from Underground as a prime example of this quality he so admired in Dostoevsky. And I think the same holds for The Depressed Person, despite and in the end partly through the purposely distant and repetitive narration, aspects of which I will address in further detail later on. The story offers a gripping, painful portrayal of the main character's tormented existence. This brings us to a question that is fundamental to reading The Depressed Person. How should we understand this portrayal that seems to critique, and in its parodic exaggeration perhaps even make fun of, its main character for her illness, depression. Because of this, Marshall Boswell calls the story the most controversial and problematic piece in Brief Interviews, referring to the angry responses of early readers. The way in which most scholars have tried to solve this problem is by denying that the story's character is truly suffering from depression. Boswell writes that the character has mistakenly and self-aggrandizingly diagnosed her narcissism as depression. This interpretation is echoed by Holland, who says, more accurately, the woman is suffering narcissism, and by D.T. Max, who writes that her clinical symptoms are revealed to be nothing more than narcissism. I think this interpretation is unsatisfactory. First of all, because it's at odds with the central importance of depression and the way it is portrayed throughout Wallace's work. For example, Kate Gompert, perhaps Infinite Jest's most severely depressed character, displays narcissistic features very similar to those of the depressed person, but this has not led scholars to doubt Kate's depression. Secondly, it would imply a facilely ironic use of language in Wallace's work, and this story specifically argues against. Calling the story and its main character the depressed person, while she is not really depressed, would be to support exactly what the addicts in Infinite Jest, the depressed person, and the hideous men in Brief Interviews are all trying to do, namely to deny that they can be accurately grasped in language, a denial indicative of narcissism. Language can't grasp how exceptional I am. In my opinion, the story does not propose a mutually exclusive decision between depression or narcissism. As said, the depressed person is a type, and as such she embodies aspects of our contemporary cultural formation. Her portrayal shows cultural tendencies conducive to depression, above all, excessive self-consciousness, leading to the experience of meaninglessness and paralysis, while also showing, on the one hand, that these tendencies that do not lead to depression for everybody are indeed partly narcissistic, and on the other hand, that if they do lead to depression, these tendencies still contain and are experienced to have narcissistic aspects, which contribute to the self-loathing that is part of depression. The question, am I not merely a narcissist? Here again, the comparison with the underground man as type is illuminating. Wallace marks the passage in Frank's biography in which Dostoevsky's use of satirical exaggeration and parodic caricature is described as ideological eschatology, a term that Wallace also copied into the margins. The term captures and identifies as a method Dostoevsky's characterization of the underground man as carrying through the logical presuppositions and possibility of the ideas of this time to their consistent conclusion. Similarly, we might say that the depressed person as type embodies a consistent thinking through of aspects of our own contemporary cultural formation as leading to depression. This includes carrying through the narcissistic aspects of that culture. Instead of regarding those aspects to somehow be the only real cause of her pain, it would be more accurate to say that the narcissistic aspects contribute to or exacerbate her pain as part of her depression. In the depressed person, we can recognize tendencies of our cultural context and ourselves, and see that it can lead to an all-pervasive suffering. To judge her as merely narcissistic would be to fail to recognize this kinship and appeal to our concern, and to deny the reality of her pain. In his review of Frank's Dostoevsky biography, Wallace writes that the power of Dostoevsky's work, and Notes from Underground specifically, lies in its admixture of the universal and the particular. That is, on the one hand, the novella and its protagonist are impossible really to understand without some knowledge of the intellectual climate of Russia in the 1860s. On the other hand, the underground man's traits are recognizable to all of us. We can all see parts of ourselves in him, Wallace writes. As we have seen, the depressed person offers a similar admixture of general and particular, with features recognizable through time, but also firmly rooted in her own historical period. In that regard, traits that Wallace identifies in the underground man could also serve to quite accurately describe the depressed person, namely a combination of self-importance and self-contempt, of rage and cowardice, of fervor and a paralyzed inability to act. Furthermore, in both the depressed person and the underground man, these traits are described as a form of illness. Taking a look at the roots and manifestations of these two characters' illnesses will show how the close affinities with Dostoevsky's novella can further guide our reading of Wallace's text. Part 1 of Notes from Underground is devoted specifically to the underground man's description of his disease, namely a heightened consciousness that imprisons him in an inertia of spiteful, wicked thoughts. In the opening sentence of the novella, the underground man states, "I'm a sick man, I'm a wicked man," or in some translations you might know it as, "I'm a sick man, I'm a spiteful man." In his copy of notes, Wallace marks the following passage that explains the underground man's sickness. "I swear, gentlemen, that to be too conscious is an illness, a real thoroughgoing illness." Throughout part one, we can discern how the underground man's being overly conscious follows from his context, his education, his time and place. He cannot not be hyper-aware. As he describes it, it all occurs according to the normal and basic laws of heightened consciousness. And what follows directly from these laws is inertia. And consequently, there is not only nothing you can do to change yourself, but there is simply nothing to do at all. In his notes for the review, Wallace expresses his agreement with the analysis of hyperreflexivity that Dostoevsky offers through his portrayal of the underground man. Vital, paralysis of hyperconsciousness. Hyperconsciousness makes life meaningless. Moreover, Wallace signals the need to extrapolate Dostoevsky's analysis to our own cultural context. Today, when culture necessitates so many more choices, so many more actions, Dostoevsky's exploration even more vital. Like the opening sentence of Dostoevsky's novella, the depressed person starts by stating its protagonist's illness. The depressed person was in terrible and unceasing emotional pain, and the impossibility of sharing or articulating this pain was in itself a component of the pain and a contributing factor in its essential horror. Throughout the story, the depressed person constantly scrutinizes her thoughts and feelings and the attempts to formulate these, all of which seem insufficient, impeding all conclusions and actions, as none can be established over others, thus making her life meaningless. An important difference between the narrations of both texts might seem to be that Notes is narrated in first person by the underground man, the text representing his notes, while the depressed person is formally narrated in the third person. However, I propose that we should see the third person narration of the latter text as Wallace's extrapolation of Dostoevsky's analysis of hyperconsciousness and its consequences. The narrative perspective represents the complete self-objectification, as if in third person, of the depressed person's self-narration. The result of the depressed person's absurd precision in clinical observation of consciousness constantly turned toward the only object that interests the depressed person, namely herself. For Dostoevsky, within the cultural formation of his time, an important factor that fueled excessive self-consciousness was the ideology of rational egoism. The underground man's sickness is rooted in him following through the ideology to its logical nihilist consequences. Rational egoism entails that, in order to achieve societal harmony and happiness, individuals should act in accordance with the supposed rational, natural laws of self-interest. However, for the underground man, doing so leads to the spiraling of self-consciousness, as he wonders what would be the rational egoistic response to something, while also realizing that all behavior involved is determined by natural laws anyway. In fact, he says, in a passage that Wallace underlines in Frank's biography, that as a result, all possible reasons for action evaporate. The object flies off into air, and the underground man finds himself locked in inertia. In his review, Wallace writes that our own culture's equivalent of this nihilist spell is in fact one of congenital skepticism. In the depressed person, hyperconsciousness and skepticism constantly feed into each other. This is recognizable above all in its main character's assertion that she is unable to describe what the depression made her feel like. The depressed person invokes terms like agony and despair, but immediately contends that such terms are in fact melodramatic and minimizing. This attempt to describe her pain conceptually, to then skeptically dismiss concepts as by definition incapable of capturing that pain, sets up the depressed person's loop of hyper-reflection. And it shows the narcissism inherent in this process, as this endless self-conscious doubt distracts her from the fact that, meanwhile, she has in fact been able to communicate her feelings, shame, guilt, self-hatred throughout. Here I also disagree with the prevailing interpretations in the existing scholarship that regards the depressed person and the other stories in brief interviews as confirming a supposed inevitable failure of language. Narcissism and the workings of language itself do not impede the depressed person's self-expression. Rather, that she convinces herself that language is incapable of expressing her inner life is an example of her narcissism. But even while describing this conviction, successful communication takes place. We should not mistake a narcissistic view that language is bound to fail as proof that language does indeed fail. However, in our understanding of the depressed person, we might experience a different obstacle than language, an aspect again reminiscent of the underground man, namely wickedness. In the opening sentence of Dostoevsky's novella, the statement, "I am a sick man," is followed by, "I am a wicked man." While both the depressed person and the underground man are in deep despair, there also seems to be, to use formulations from Notes from Underground, something crafty, a paradoxical pleasure in their expressions of their pain. The underground man describes the pleasure he takes in his suffering via the example of not going to the dentist to get a toothache treated and moaning as a result, with Wallace marking the following passage, writing toothache in the margins. But they are not candid moans, they are malignant moans, and the malignancy is the whole point. The enjoyment of the sufferer finds expression in those moans. This is one example of what the underground man calls his spitefulness or wickedness. Due to his heightened consciousness, all possible actions have become meaningless, and the underground man is locked in inertia, filled with self-loathing about the emptiness he suffers as a result of his own continuous inertia. At the same time, this heightened consciousness, his awareness of the full implications of the beliefs of his time, gives the underground man a feeling of superiority. As such, he turns the humiliation of his suffering into a wicked, paradoxical enjoyment. With regard to the toothache, the underground man remarks that he knows that his moans will be of no use to him. He knows better than anyone that he is only straining and irritating himself and others in vain. These others are needed to further exacerbate his humiliation before them. Wallace underlines the underground man's conclusion. The enjoyment was just from the too intense consciousness of one's own degradation. The depressed person also seems to use her suffering manipulatively in her interactions with her therapist and with the members of her support system in order to both deepen her own humiliation, urging others to tell her exactly how loathsome she is, but also to somehow establish her superiority over them, constantly underscoring her own complete awareness and honesty while questioning that of her friends. We can clearly see this, for example, when the depressed person says to her best support system friend that she wished to hear her brutally honest opinion of her as a person, the potentially negative and judging and hurtful parts. This felt to her like an almost literal matter of life and death. Note how in this passage the depressed person tries to shame the friend into admitting her negative and judging and hurtful opinions about the depressed person, and similarly how presenting this manipulatively as an almost literal matter of life and death, the depressed person forces the friend to give in to her demand, thus asserting power to increase her self-loathing. Now, it is important to emphasize that none of these aspects of the depressed person's wickedness, her self-loathing and manipulation, serve to deny the reality of the depressed person's pain. She genuinely suffers from horrible torment, like the underground man. Even though their misery is deepened by their own narcissistic vanity, in an attempt to draw paradoxical pleasure or strength from the depths of their humiliation, both texts facilitate the acknowledgement, which these characters themselves cannot muster, of their character's true despair and its cultural origins. The endings of the depressed person in part 1 of Notes from Underground might be seen to point to an alternative, namely a leap of faith in the form of a manifestation of empathy. Toward the end of part 1 of Notes, the underground man implies that if he were shown some faith-based, meaningful connection to something beyond himself, he would devote himself to it. And part 2 of Notes can be seen to describe his confrontation with the actuality of such an ideal, which I will go on to read in combination with brief interview number 20. The depressed person ends with a long plea by its protagonist, punctuated by questions about how to describe and understand herself. What all she'd so painfully learned said about her, reads the question that concludes the story. This final passage places the reader in the position of a support friend to the depressed person. The long, winding plea and repeated questions signal the depressed person's inability to believe that she is heard and understood, to actually give herself over to that other. Thus, the reader becomes the site of faith, of the willingness to feel the feelings of the depressed person with her as her questions and thereby the story end. Even though the depressed person partly undermines her own professed desire to communicate by her seeming unwillingness or inability to stop asking questions at the end of the story, convinced that she will never be understood anyway, through those questions directed via the support friend to the reader, the space for communication, the possibility for our empathetic understanding, has been circumscribed within the story. The depressed person's inability to believe in successful communication finds its equivalent in Notes from Underground, for example, in a passage marked by Wallace, in which the underground man comments on his own writing and addressing readers in his notes. "It is a form, an empty form. I shall never have readers. I made this plain already." To which Wallace adds in the margins, "To whom?" Obviously, the underground man has a reader in us at that moment, and what has become plain to us is that these notes are not an empty form, but a multi-layered form, a multi-layered expression of suffering. This dynamic of other-directed attention is thematized explicitly in Part 2 of Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground and in Wallace's short story, Brief Interview number 20. Both texts center on the encounter between a self-centered male protagonist, a hideous man in the terms of Wallace's story, and a female character who seems to embody an opposite, more empathetic life view. And these encounters are claimed by both protagonists to have some sort of unexpected impact on them. In an interview on Bookworm, Wallace described Brief Interview number 20 as the best of the interviews and one I identify the most with. We might speculate that this evaluation, and especially Wallace's own personal identification with the story, can be connected to Wallace's identification with Dostoyevsky's novella, Notes, which in turn might underlie its many links with Brief Interview number 20. Because tellingly, in his notes for his review of Frank's biography, Wallace writes the following: "Humiliation for me. In college, I found Notes moving because I saw myself, the self I loathed and hid, the self that felt I was different, above and below everyone, that I was I and they are all. Yet in Frank I discover, in volume 3, page 334, that overweening vanity is the essential nature of the underground man, and that whole sections are nothing but an extended mockery of the underground man's stilted and pedantic responses to the simplest human situations." And on the page of the biography that this note refers to, page 334, Wallace underlines the following passage and writes DFW in the margin. "The underground man's vanity convinces him of his own superiority and he despises everyone. But since he desires such superiority to be recognized by others, he hates the world for its indifference and falls into self-loathing at his own humiliating dependence." These quotations could actually serve to capture the main dynamic of Brief Interview number 20. Like the underground man, the protagonist of Brief Interview number 20, the interviewee as I will call him, feels a similar superiority and wants this to be recognized by others. In the case of the story, most specifically his female interviewer, but also by extension the reader, whom he tries to convince of his vain, fantastic conversion story, but who doesn't believe him, after which he lashes out misogynistically and humiliated. As we already know from the discussion of part 1 of Notes, the underground man suffers from a heightened consciousness, and like the depressed person, so does the male interviewee in Brief Interview number 20. Throughout the story, the interviewee emphasizes his awareness of the ways in which his words, and the words that he describes to others, might be interpreted. This leads him, for example, to constantly quote mark the expressions of the woman he had met, such as what she kept calling, quote, focus, and using the quote, L word itself several times without irony, or even any evident awareness that the word has, through tactical overdeployment, become trite and requires invisible quotes around it now at the very least. The woman lacks the interviewee's hyper-awareness and is thus deemed naive by contrast. The interviewee stresses his knowingness with regard to his own utterances through phrases such as, and yes, and don't worry, I'm aware of how all this sounds. I know I'm not telling you anything you haven't already decided you know, and I know that what you will make of this. Both the underground man and the interviewee regard their heightened consciousness as a sign of their superiority, of their intelligence and education. The underground man calls himself a developed and educated man, as a man of our time ought to be developed, who has read books as others were unable to read. The interviewee describes himself as a reasonably experienced, educated man, someone who worked himself through both college and 2 years now of postgraduate school. An important part of the educated heightened consciousness of the underground man and the interviewee is an awareness of the constructed nature of their realities. We have already seen that the underground man's hyperconsciousness locks him in an inertia in which all reasons and actions seem equally meaningless. And he can only act out of wickedness, out of transgressive debauchery, creating suffering for himself and others, which he is consciously eliciting, which, because he is consciously eliciting it, grants him a felt superiority. In part 2 of notes to this purpose, the underground man plays with the beautiful and lofty images and ideals of romanticism, deriving his actions from examples out of books. For example, suddenly a horizon of appropriate activity would present itself, beneficent, beautiful, and above all, quite ready-made. He consciously shapes his life through these ready-made constructs and standards taken from literature. For him, the literary, the explicitly artificial, we might say, is in fact more real. The interviewee in brief interview number 20 is another example of the congenital skepticism that Wallace describes as our own culture's nihilist spell. As I just described, the interviewee's hyperconsciousness manifests itself mainly as a skepticism with regard to language. A typical product of contemporary academia, he emphasizes that supposedly natural language fails to signify and that communication is bound to falter due to the interpretability of all speech. His attitude is a popular version of deconstructive strategies and discourse analysis, claiming to undermine any naive claim or belief. Therefore, the interviewee is contemptuous of the woman he meets because of the naivete of her beliefs in language use, calling her a granola cruncher characterized by emotional incontinence and a gooey and somewhat canned vocabulary. Similarly, the underground man takes the prostitute Lisa to be simple-hearted, as naive, childlike. When she shrugs off one of his questions by saying, "I don't think anything," the underground man slightly remarks, "And that's what's bad, that you don't think." And their contempt for this perceived naivete, this lack of critical thinking, goes hand in hand with the underground man's and the interviewee's violent, aggressive attitude towards these women. The interviewee describes his pickup of the woman as criminally easy, as exploitative and mercenary, as him sauntering carnivorously over to her. Further examples of his aggressive objectification of the woman are his friend's comments about how long estrus lasts in her species, and comparing her to a smooth, blank, perfect piece of pseudo-art you want to buy so you can take it home, which is interrupted mid-word by one of the interviewer's unspecified questions, but the obvious completion seems to be to smash the piece of pseudo-art, clearly symbolizing an aggressive attitude toward the woman. Are we all doing still? Okay? Hanging in there? Great, so am I. Still got some stuff to cover, but we're getting there. So, next slide. Yes. Similarly, the underground man states that upon seeing Lisa in the brothel, something nasty stung me. I went straight up to her. By chance, I looked in a mirror. My agitated face seemed to be repulsive in the extreme. I thought, I'm precisely glad that'll seem repulsive to her. I like it. Later on, he describes, in a passage that Wallace marks in his copy of notes, being infuriated by Lisa's naivety and sensing vaguely that she was going to pay dearly for it all. Also, he states, a wicked feeling took hold of me. You just wait, I thought. Both the underground man and the interviewee are out to physically, that is, sexually and mentally subdue best these women, whom they regard as naive, inferior. However, for both protagonists, their confession of their disparaging and predatory behavior also serves as a counterpoint to their subsequent claim to some sort of conversion. In Frank's Dostoevsky biography, Wallace underlines the following passage. The redemption of the prostitute theme had become a commonplace by the 1860s. The encounter between the underground man and the prostitute Lisa is an ironic parody and reversal of this social romantic cliché. It is my contention that brief interview number 20 offers a similar parody and reversal of aspects of the story's own ideological context, namely of popular deconstructions of language and the accompanying skepticism. On the same page of the biography, Wallace underlines another description, writing linked to 1990's PC in the margin, of how Dostoevsky felt that the ideologies of his cultural formation had fostered its own kind of egoism and vanity, which allowed the intelligentsia to live in a dream world of universal beneficence, while neglecting to turn their abstract love of humanity into a concrete act directed toward a flesh and blood individual. This is precisely the theme of the second part of Notes from Underground. Similarly, brief interview number 20 thematizes how constant, supposedly critical self-scrutiny and diagnosis of the failures of language become removed from any real social commitment and instead serve to demonstrate one's sophistication and serve as a strategy for one's selfish and vain purposes. And likely, this is also what Wallace has in mind when he links Dostoevsky's critique to 1990s political correctness, as an ideology that has become merely self-congratulatory and no longer entails emancipatory action. In Notes from Underground, the parody of ideological tropes lies in the underground man playing with the social romantic fantasy of him as altruistic male benefactor, saving the despairing prostitute, while making clear that he is in fact indulging in that romantic trope for his own pleasure, and trying to humiliate and subdue Lisa in order to feel superior. Subsequently, the reversal lies in the fact that it is Lisa who is shown to be morally superior, and who represents, through an act of selfless forgiveness, a possibility of redemption for the underground man, who is, however, unable to embrace that possibility. In brief interview number 20, the parodic element lies not just in the portrayal of the interviewee's hyperreflexivity and skepticism, but also in his subsequent appropriation of the redemption narrative of the woman he meets. He claims that her story of having prevented being murdered by a sexual psychopath through self-forgetful, empathetic attention changed him into a more loving, selfless person, the woman thus mirroring Lisa in her redemptive role. However, the fact that he treats the woman's story almost solely in terms of how it affected him belies this claim to conversion. The reversal in brief interview number 20, so this parody and reversal element, the reversal in brief interview number 20 is that all of this lies in plain sight, and that the redemptive qualities of attention and empathy are not embodied by the man in the story, but are to be generated by the reader in paying attention to what is there. The reader can see that it is not language that fails, that bars the interviewee from achieving or expressing his conversion, his love, but that it is his specific use of language that clearly belies there has been such a conversion at all. The reader does not achieve this by granting the failure of language that the interviewee ascribes to, because, as with the depressed person, that would entail accepting the inevitability of his narcissistic and skepticistic stance, but by trusting language and paying close attention to something outside ourselves, thereby exhibiting the qualities that the interviewee claims but fails to embody. Let me break down the aspects of this parody and reversal in brief interview number 20, partly in light of the significant parallels with part 2 of Notes from Underground. The interviewee presents his story as a confession, as an honest admission of his flaws and flawed behavior. His repeated acknowledgement of his purely sexual interest in the woman serves to suggest his honesty. At the same time, as part of his confession story, the interviewee describes how such brutal honesty was in fact part of his seduction strategy of the woman he met. Her typology here dictated a tactic of what appeared to be a blend of embarrassed confession and brutal candor. I quote, confessed that, know something about her that made it somehow impossible to deploy anything less than total honesty now forced me to confess that I had in fact deliberately approached her blanket. Note how his formulation that he, quote, confessed, and in another part of this same passage that I didn't put on the slide, he also speaks of a, quote, confession, signals that, by his own standards, the notion of confession should be regarded ironically as trite, meaningless. Furthermore, note that even though the interviewee claims to have been changed by a woman's story, he retains his contempt for the views that underlie that story. He speaks generally about people with such views such as the woman's, and in present tense when he describes that essential at center life is just a cute pet bunny fluffiness about them that makes it so exceedingly hard to take them seriously or not to end up feeling as if you're exploiting them in some way. This dishonesty, this back and forth in his claims about the woman, is in fact an interesting similarity with Notes. Like the interviewee oscillates between regarding the woman with contempt as a purely sexual conquest and claiming to have been genuinely interested in her, the underground man says about Lisa, it was the game that fascinated me most of all. But then on the next page he says, I swear she really did interest me. And a couple of pages later, this ambiguity is captured in one and the same sentence. It was the game that fascinated me, not just the game, however. Even in the protagonist's moments of supposed appreciation of these women, their predatorial contempt remains clear. For example, the underground man observes about Lisa, so she too is already capable of certain thoughts, and then comments on this realization, stating, devil take it, that's curious, it's akin. The underground man surprises Lisa's capacity for thought, and then his designation of her as it, as an object, indicate his denial of her humanity. Likewise, in the interviewee's account, there are several slips that reveal his dishonesty about his changed appreciation of the woman's qualities and his supposed conversion as a result. For example, he says, there was an equanimity about her, a sense of residence in herself, or a type of artlessness that resembled a type of intent concentration. He clearly wants to say disingenuousness here, or disingenuous equanimity, which would fit with his earlier characterizations of her, but then interrupts and retracts the negative qualification, and then notice how the subsequent stumble, that did, does, and the final choice for resembled instead of is or was, suggest that he's trying to suppress his real thoughts about the woman. Perhaps most importantly, both Notes from Underground and Brief Interview number 20 feature the narration of a story, or anecdote, that forms the basis for subsequent claims to conversion. In Brief Interview number 20, the interviewee claims that he was moved to change by the woman telling him an anecdote about how she prevented being murdered by a sexual psychopath through empathetic attention toward that psychopath. And let me note right away that the interviewee's choice for this odd term, anecdote, so inappropriate to the gravity of the woman's story, is one of the many cues to doubt the reliability of the interviewee's retelling of the woman's story. On the surface, it might seem that part 2 of Notes offers a very different situation, because therein it is the underground man who tells Lisa a story, an anecdote, if you will. But the similarity lies in the story's effect on Lisa. The underground man wants to humiliate her, but she treats him with kindness and empathy. And above all, the underground man's experience of that treatment and his response to it. The story that the underground man tells Lisa is about the inevitable fate of prostitutes like herself. He says, "They were carrying a coffin out today and almost dropped it. Yes, in the Haymarket. They were carrying it out of a basement. You'll die someday, and just the same way as that one today. She was also a girl. She died of consumption." He suggests he's telling her this story because he wants her to change course in his life before it is too late. But he overwhelms her with all this romantic imagery, playing on the theme of the male benefactor and the despairing prostitute, in order to crush her, to elevate himself at her expense. He thinks, with pictures, I'll get you with these pictures. To Lisa, he says, you'll go to another place, then to a third, then somewhere else, and finally you'll reach the Haymarket. And in perhaps his most horrible statement, the underground man concludes sadistically, your name will disappear from the face of the earth. In the case of Brief Interview number 20, we have to keep in mind that the interviewee's narration frames the woman's story. He's in fact retelling her account to his female interviewer. In this respect, it is interesting to note that the woman's story about the psychopath could be seen as an allusion to the interviewee's predatorial behavior toward her. Conventional relationships terrify him. While his exalted sensation of total godlike control over her, what she feels, whether she feels, breathes, lives, this allows him some margin of safety in the relationship. In fact, the interviewee explicitly points out this possible comparison between himself and the psychopath. But here we have to observe that the interviewee invites this comparison in order to subsequently argue and associate himself with the cathartic, even transfiguring effect the encounter with the psychopath has on the woman, and to ultimately, despite some similarities, to set himself apart from the psychopath and use his claim to conversion as proof of their fundamental difference. By carefully attending to these steps in his telling, we can see how these actually confirm his continued predatory, manipulative attitude. The woman's story clearly contains elements that are to be taken as positive. Virtues we might see as being supported by Wallace's fiction in general, above all her emphasis on the importance of attention. But we should discern that the interviewee, in his retelling of the story, is cynically playing with these ideas. For example, the strategy he ascribes to the woman of confronting rape with love and attention, and thereby preventing being murdered, is an obviously problematic idea, to say the least. But the interviewee's cynical attempt to reframe this situation as predation, becomes even clearer when he claims, "It struck me that this behavior of hers during the rape was an unintentional but tactically ingenious way to, in a way, prevent it or transfigure it, the rape, to transcend its being a vicious attack or violation, since if a woman as a rapist comes at her and savagely mounts her, can somehow choose to give herself, sincerely and compassionately, she cannot be truly violated or raped, no." The interviewee goes further to describe that for the woman, the psychopath had served as an instrument of growth in her faith and capacity to focus and alter energy fields by the action of her compassion. What is important here is that the interviewee's claim about the woman's suffering and her supposed transfiguration of it are only about himself, only serve his own self-presentation. If he is the psychopath, or like him, he actually helped her grow. Similarly, in Notes, after telling Lisa the story about her likely fate, the underground man becomes afraid that Lisa might actually come to him for help, while he only wants to play with romantic imagery and not actually rescue a prostitute. He then persuades himself that he, in fact, acted nobly, restoring his felt superiority with regard to Lisa, and that she will benefit, that his words will have a cathartic effect on her. He says, "Why dishonorable? What's dishonorable? I precisely wanted to evoke noble feelings in her. If she cried a bit, that's good. It'll have good effect." Furthermore, the interviewee appropriates the woman's supposedly redemptive experience for himself. He claims that he started to exhibit the same type of attention as the woman. "And I was experiencing the same thing, listening. I was listening both intellectually and emotionally. But when we compare the form of attention ascribed to the woman and the type of attention exhibited by the interviewee, this clearly belies his conversion claim. The woman's attitude is described as other-directed and self-forgetful in many different ways, as unself-conscious attention, focus, connection, soul connection, compassion, and compassion focus. Conversely, the interviewee, even in his descriptions of his supposedly converted attention, still focuses above all on himself, how he is paying attention, how he decides to interpret things, etc. For example, I was now captivated enough by the anecdote to simply accept terminology as a kind of foreign language. I just decided to presume that focus was her obscure denomination's euphemism for prayer. What I remember best is that by this time, it was, for the first time, taking much less effort to listen to her. This is all about him, not about the story itself or about the woman. His retelling of the story is above all a description of his experience and responses to it, a focus on him, not on the other. I think Notes from Underground provides us with a partner text that confirms the falsity of the interviewee's claim to conversion. When at the end of the novella, Lisa actually shows up at the underground man's house for help, she finds him in poverty and sees him for what he really is, in the same way that in brief interview number 20, the woman recognizes, via her story, the interviewee for the predator he is. The underground man is humiliated, lashes out at Lisa, but then, unexpectedly, she responds with empathy and kindness. However, he cannot reciprocate her self-forgetful and other-directed attitude. Instead, he rapes her, another parallel to the interviewee as sexual predator. It is interesting to note that in both brief interview number 20 and Notes, the women leave their hideous counterparts behind, down the hall and never seeing her again, to use the formulation from brief interview number 20. The underground man again tries to frame his behavior as having a virtuous effect on Lisa. Won't it be better if she now carries an insult away with her forever? The insult will elevate and purify her. Which is better, cheap happiness or lofty suffering? But such self-deceptive manipulations are also exactly why there is no redemption in sight for the underground man himself. Part 2 of Notes is written from the perspective of the underground man looking back on these events later in life. And it is clear that the encounter with Lisa has not changed him. In fact, it haunts him. In a passage that Wallace marks in his copy of Notes, the underground man states that, But I did not know then that even after 15 years I would still be picturing Lisa precisely with the pathetic, twisted, needless smile she had at that moment. Elsewhere in the text, the underground man exclaims about Lisa, "You don't know what this woman is." And Wallace marks this passage in his copy of Notes, and at the end of the sentence writes, "Salvation. The woman is salvation." This brings to mind the interviewee's claim, "I believe she could save me. I believe she could save me." Both the underground man and the interviewee, in their encounter with these female characters, run up against the unsatisfactoriness of their own life views. And they seem to realize that these encounters represent the possibility of an alternative. But they are unable to transform, to embrace salvation, and any claims to conversion that they make are continuations of their hyper-reflexive wickedness. But note that while the need for ethical attention that the female characters represent is not realized in the tellings of the interviewee and the underground man, Note that while the need for ethical attention is not realized in the tellings of the interviewee and the underground man, it is the reader who is positioned by these texts to realize such attention in the act of reading the story. We cannot do so by sharing the interviewee's belief in the inevitable faltering of language, by saying that language by definition prevents the expression of earnestness, or that the impossibility of giving meaning to love is what love is. Wallace is inviting us to convert from critical, suspicious readers into trusting, attentive readers by showing us, through the figure of the interviewee, what the former leads to, while realizing that trust and attention do not entail simple naivete. As the woman can be said to see through the interviewee, it is our trust in language and our focused single-point attention to how the interviewee uses language that allows us to see through his claims, thereby constituting in the reader what the interviewee fails to realize. Okay, now I'll quickly wrap this up. The fictions of Wallace and other existentialist writers, including Dostoevsky, have often been critiqued as, in the end, failing to portray the virtues, such as empathy, that these authors profess with regard to their work and the world. I think this critique is inaccurate. Rather, what the works in question can be said to do is prompt readers to become aware of their own role in and the processes of reading that lead to conclusions of empathy or lack of empathy. So while the main characters of the Depressed Person Brief Interview number 20 and Notes from Underground are unable to overcome the hyperreflexivity fostered by their respective cultural formations and the skepticism, depression, and wickedness it leads to, these texts, by inviting careful attention to these characters' thoughts, behaviors, and descriptions, position the reader to embody the virtues implied to be needed in their stories, namely attention and empathy, having read and experienced what the characters deemed themselves unable to express. Thank you. I guess this is where you start asking me snarky questions. I hope that was somewhat entertaining. Vern,
So, thank
can I turn this mic off, actually? Yeah?
Excellent. I loved it. It's fantastic. So thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question about one of the persistent themes of the talk, which was skepticism in language, and then at the end you gestured towards trust in language. And I wonder what you think how that works in Wallace. And I'm asking because, like in Eon of the Splurm, for instance, he seems to take that skepticism seriously.
Yeah.
So he's not trying to just dismiss it. And as you said, it's not simple naivete. So I just wonder what you think that relationship is between the skepticism that language can really grasp the real about human life, while at the same time having some sort of trust in interpersonal communication relationships.
Yeah. Thank you. Complicated question. I'm probably going to sort of digress and answer part of the question. Then please steer me back to the main question. Well, first let me note that one of the reasons I focused on sort of the language and skepticism so much is because it's such a dominant factor in let's say, the existing scholarship on the story, which always sort of goes along with, well, language doesn't sort of express, and then maybe that the interviewee sort of exploits this, right? But the position itself is not really questioned, right? Language is to be treated with skepticism, and there's no remedy for the skepticism, it seems, in most of these readings. And I think that's a flawed position, because the skepticism that deals with is actually a very easy skepticism. It's a skepticism about language that it's sort of a straw man construct, right? It says, well, if we take language to be this sort of perfect representation of what the world really is, or what I really think, then language will fail to do that, then it will never work, and it will always be interpretations, etc. But the problem is in that initial sort of idealized perception of language. Okay. I think that is a problem. That is the problem that some of the scholarship on the story maybe hasn't questioned sufficiently. I think what Wallace does is, in that sense, maybe, well, what I associate with Wittgenstein is take the skepticism seriously. That skepticism is a real deal. We feel sometimes that our words are only, gesturing toward things at best, or we're struggling to find our words, and this might sometimes discourage us about feeling that we've actually said anything. Well, as these conference panels and the Q&As afterward often sort of illustrate, that we've really said anything sort of insightful or meaningful. But I think that experience itself does not mean that language fails. You can take a careful look at that and question whether that sort of facile skepticism is actually warranted. And I think Wallace's position would be, it's not. The skepticism itself is perhaps an almost inevitable part of our own sort of workings, our experiences of language. But it's one of its aspects, one of its effects that we're supposed to also overcome, and to, in a sense, to see and to, as Wittgenstein would say, sort of to treat therapeutically, not sort of accept and then, in a sense, exploit for our own, convenience. So, is that an answer to your question?
Yeah.
So I think yes, that skepticism is real, and Wallace takes it seriously, and it should be taken seriously, but in a different way. And I think this is partly a result of, so much interpretation of Wallace focusing on Wallace's position in, let's say, the tradition of American literature, and always relating him as somehow responding to American postmodernist literature, in which this sort of this analysis of language plays a primary role. Well, we talked about this yesterday, that in some of these schools of literary critique, there is this sort of perhaps watered down appropriation of Derrida, which leads to these, what I would say, sometimes slightly sort of facile critiques of language. And those are the critiques I think Wallace sort of dislikes, and he at the same time sees as having somehow sort of percolated through into the general culture at large, right? Where everybody, that's what you say, and you can never really know what anybody thinks or feels or does, and therefore just do what you want to say, and it has to be about yourself. To go back to your paper, it sort of reinforces this sort of nice sort of self-absorption, and that's obviously not what Derrida wants, and probably also not what most of these critics want. But it's sort of this unintended sort of cultural consequence. And it is somehow bound up that the scholarship looks so much towards this, with this focus on the American tradition. And that is also why I find it so interesting to work with Dostoevsky. Because it seems to me like for Wallace personally, there were a lot of authors, including Dostoevsky, so much more important than Barth or Pynchon or whoever. And we need to take a very careful look at that. And I hope to make some sort of, well, not beginnings, but sort of some further steps in that process. Sorry, that was a long answer. I'm going to shut up now. Yeah.
I found myself reflecting on a few times in your speech where you talked about the notes that Wallace made in the text of the people he was reading. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, finding that sort of marginal notes and how those marginal notes helped you to get an idea of making these connections here.
Yeah.
Because you're sort of portraying Wallace here as a reader.
Or at least how putting some of those readings, so the evidence of those readings, next to brief interview number 20, knowing that he wrote these things in the same period roughly, how that might shed light on it. That would be sort of my process. Well, I mean, as to Dostoevsky, I remember it was my first day in the reading room at the Ransom Center, and I thought, let's start, nice and nice and shiny and positive. Let's do some Dostoevsky, and let me just order his volumes of the Frank biography. Let me just sort of look at them here. And that was my first day, my first hour in the Ransom Center, and I open up, especially volume 3, and the margin are filled with notes. And some of them are just sort of copying terms into the margins and sort of thinking, because he is obviously also reading it for the review. And then sometimes he has these comments in the margins that say use. And when you look at many of those moments where he writes that, most obviously, that obviously refers to moments that he wants to use for the review. But when you look at what he identifies, all of those moments are actually statements about the purpose of literature and about how to write that sort of, what is it, morally radiant fiction that he talks about. So even though perhaps literally he meant use for the review, I think we might be allowed to say he's in a sense saying use for my own shaping of my sort of perception of what literature is, what it's supposed to do, etc., which in the end the review is also about, right? It's only tentatively really a review of the biography. Is that an answer to your question? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. But what I also should say, so there's the volumes of the biography, but there's also a separate notebook that it's pages and pages of him sort of listing his main comments sort of per page, and then on other pages sort of trying to set up potential sort of lines of argument for the review. And that's just a wealth of information. And what I tried to do, and I don't know whether that was at points a little bit annoying, but I tried to cram as much information from that in the presentation as possible and put all those quotes on the slides, at least for as far they were relevant to my argument. But there's a lot of stuff there. Yeah.
If I may kind of continue with Vern's question a little bit, when you talked about in Notes to the Underground, the narrator saying that that I know that I might not have readers, or whatever the quote was. One thing that I'm very interested by is with these hyper-reflexive characters in Wallace's work, a lot of times they're first-person narrators. And that's really interesting to me because I'm not sure what it's supposed to say about these characters, that they're saying they can't express themselves to other people, but they're still addressing the reader directly. Whereas with the depressed person, or when the narrator in Infinite Jest talks about Oren and the way that he picks up girls and says, with this hip transcendence thing, it's very interesting to me when the narrators are included and kind of grouped in with you and they're only speaking to the reader. I was wondering what you might make of that in terms of the literary significance, or what's being said about communication and the extent to which it's possible between author and reader and everyone else.
And you mean sort of in this sort of the distinction between the moments that he uses third person and first person? Well, let me maybe start with the depressed person first. I had a whole much longer thing, but time on that third person element in the depressed person. There's a couple of further thoughts I have about that, but I really feel when I read that story that it's so oddly sort of clinical and distanced, and at the same time that seems to be so much part of the depressed person's problem that I find the idea that it's in a sense a self-objectified third person talking about herself in third person. I find that a very, for me, that's a very insightful way of reading the story. There is sort of a way of adding another level to this, and that is that I don't know if you've ever noticed in reading the depressed person, but now I have to get my copy. But the way that he uses quote marks in that story. So Wallace, when he renders direct speech, he always, correct me if I'm doing it the wrong way around here, but he always uses single quotes. And then quotations within quotations are double quote marks. The quote marks in the depressed person are double quote marks. And that suggests sort of that the single quote marks, in a sense, lie outside the frame of the story, that it's all one sort of utterance. That might be an utterance of the depressed person who is in fact speaking about herself in third person. You might also hypothesize that it's an utterance of another figure who in a sense presents us with this narrative of this depressed woman. And in a sense who mocks her. So in one of the first handwritten notes for the depressed person, he actually writes at the top of the page, brief interviews with hideous men, question mark, I think. Don't pin me down on that, whether the question mark is there. And I think it's potentially quite insightful to see the depressed person as actually a story being told by a hideous man. Because the way that the woman is portrayed in the story is very negative and very, she's I think the reader is constantly tempted to find the woman whiny and attention-seeking, and all the. We're very much tempted to judge her in that way. And to me, that could suggest sort of a narrator above the story, who's trying to elicit that response from readers. And that is also exactly how the hideous men in the other stories talk about usually female characters, about women in their stories. So I think that is quite interesting, and that's also why I'm so disappointed. Disappointed is a strong word, but what I find a bit striking about how most scholars writing about that story are so willing to say that the woman is whiny, right? That she is whiny, that she is attention-seeking, that she's merely a narcissist and not really depressed. I think that's going for that bait that seems quite obvious to me that we shouldn't take in that story. Then as to other characters who might be similar in some ways, but narrated in different forms, I think third person is in many ways sort of a clear way of conveying characters who are, either unwilling or unable to communicate, because you can sort of just describe them from the outside, it leaves open whether there is or is not access to their experience. But I also think it's interesting that Wallace often tries to describe these characters from first person, and I think it even, for many of these characters, they could even indulge in these sort of confession stories, because it's, in a sense, for them, if you picture this as a confession, as somebody actually accepting that he or she has readers, it is also a form of attention. Right? You might still feel, well, they're not understanding me anyway, but I am. It's all about me. So it's a gratifying of the narcissism that these characters clearly exhibit. So that's why I think that both of those modes could work really well in Wallace's, or do work well in Wallace's work. Is that an?
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you.
Well, thank you. But yeah, I'm glad it's an answer to the question. Yeah.
First, thanks. I thought this was fantastic. There's like so many things to respond to. In your reading of both of the Wallace stories, you make that sort of turn at the end and say the stories, create a space for the reader to respond empathetically, that they do something to us, which is, how I read Wallace as well, right? That he identifies a problem and then wants to try to solve it through his fiction. In a sense, it's almost a reader response kind of thing, that it's going to do something to us, and that's part of the point. But at the same time, I think correctly, you're critiquing the interviewee in brief interviews 20 for focusing on what hearing the lady's story does to him.
Yeah.
You're saying that that's a form of sort of self-centered narcissism.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, is there a tension there? Like why is his focus on how hearing the story changes him in a positive way bad?
Yeah.
Whereas our critical discussion about how these stories does something good. Like, how do we not become that person when we're trying to figure out what these stories do to us?
Yeah, thank you. This is one of those things that you have something in your paper, you cut it out in the hope that somebody asks something about it. So thank you for that question. I don't think there's anything wrong potentially with the man claiming that listening to the woman's story changed him. I just don't think that when you look at the supposed descriptions of his change, that there is a real change there. And I think the problem is that he's not paying attention to the woman. He's only paying attention to himself. And I think the difference then would be, and that also I think has a parallel in modes of reading, right? If I'm reading the story and paying attention to the story, and mostly my attention is with the story and trying to see what is there, what is happening to the man, what is happening to the woman, and how the form of the story, the attention is not on me and my agenda towards the text. That actually, I would see that as a parallel of what Wallace wants to do and what would qualify also within the world of the story as a good form of attention. if we go towards the story with some sort of, well, either some sort of really heavy sort of theoretical agenda already waiting for the story, and actually not paying so much attention to the story, but using it mostly to confirm your suspicions about Wallace or the theoretical convictions that you already have, then it's going to be more problematic, because then you might not be paying as much attention to the story as you could. You can, of course, combine those things. In many ways, I'm also trying to do that. I have certain interests that I'm trying to sort of see in the story. But I do think that it is important that you try to respond to what is happening in the story and see how that indeed somehow, partly also hopefully it changes me in reading of the story, but that happens by me directing myself towards the story and what is happening in that story, and not constantly thinking, and now for the first time I found the woman oddly fascinating, and I wasn't bored with her anymore. Right? So that would be is that?
Yeah, no, I don't think that was well put.
So yeah, those would be my thoughts about that. Yeah.
I think just to respond to that question and your focus on, which I think is really important, that idea of not allowing the kind of the impossibility sometimes of language to allow further discussion, and then, as you say, it kind of then regresses back and it doesn't really go anywhere, but to actually kind of push through and recognise that language is doing something. I think that's what I kind of took from this, which I found very useful, so thank you for that. In response to the last one, and this comes up in one of your quotes, which I thought was kind of interesting as well, is the tendency, the amount of kind of slippage within the interviewee's discussion of the granola cruncher, where he corrects himself. He talks about her in the past tense and then corrects it to the present tense. And I think the example that I've got from yours was he was talking about the type of
the typology dictates brutal honesty.
Yeah, that a type of I wrote it down that did, and then he corrects himself.
Yeah.
Does, and also I suppose a kind of a wider point, more kind of the question for everyone as well, is that do we get a sense of that in this collection there is an engagement with toxic masculinity, for want of a better phrase.
Yeah.
There is an engagement with the notion of rape culture,
okay.
And that is, at least I found that a very, I suppose, a very pressing thing. Otherwise, we wouldn't have, the safe zones that we see all around campus. There would be no need for stuff like that. That weren't the case. But that this, at the end, this kind of slippage that. Did you not see? I could not let her go.
Yeah.
And the past tense kind of comes in as if, again, there is something more sinister with this guy's story.
Yeah.
That potentially she hasn't walked off down the hole. Potentially he has seen this through to the the gruesome end of killing somebody.
Yeah.
And that does that keeping attention, I suppose. Does that kind of necessitate then, further dialogue? Which I see this as, I suppose, kind of slightly different from a lot of the other fiction that you put out. That the idea that this was not commercial. This didn't have to be a commercial success. You're sitting on a genius grant, and you were told to do something. So there were no commercial. Do I have to please anybody? This is. This kind of sits outside of those commercial constraints. And that, it's problematic, obviously, with, the way kind of, I suppose, aspects of Wallace's behaviour has come to light or has been kind of sat on for a little while, but that still there is something, there is something to say, which I think came out exceptionally well through the Dostoevsky link as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear that. What I think is that sentence, I could not. Don't you understand that after this I could not let her go? I mean, that was one, so thank you. That was another one of those things where I thought, okay, if I'm going to include this, you know, that takes some time to unpack. But let me now say something, hopefully somewhat insightful about it. So I've suggested throughout that in many ways you can also read, we don't even really know whether this woman told this story, right? So it might even be sort of his big sort of construction of, you know, actually how this woman perceived him. There are all kinds of hints that all kinds of aspects of the story are made up. For example, what the sexual psychopath looks like, right? At one point he clearly racializes that description, and then all the way at the end he says, well, actually, it now turns out that, you know, maybe he didn't look like that, and actually she didn't trust me, so she didn't tell anything about the features of this man. So, and I think that comment, don't you understand that I could not let her go, might actually be another reference to the fact that he is in fact the sexual predator, he is the rapist, and that he indeed perhaps committed rape, and that the story is in many ways about him, but that he's trying to twist it, and in a sense, like The Underground Man does, present this sort of fantastic, oddly elaborate sort of conversion narrative, which in the end excuses him for his behavior, because trust me, I have also now changed my ways. I used to be, you know, a somewhat objectifying male, but I have learned, I've seen that there might be some similarities to these real psychopaths, but at the same time, not really, right? So I think that sentence really fits in that sort of structure, and it is another hint that the story is in fact about him, and that it's actually the woman seeing through him and seeing him for what he is. And yeah, that it refers to his behavior. Does that respond somewhat to what you were saying?
Yeah, I mean it does, and I suppose that again speaks to your point of, you know, not approaching this with a particular either kind of theoretical or, you know, with a sort of with a route map in mind, because then you will only ever presumably arrive at that conclusion. I mean, allowing for multiple ways of viewing this.
Yeah, then you're going to try and see how certain characters' position represents certain theoretical positions, and then it might seem as if this, I mean, the reference is also so obvious that he says, and 2 years of postgraduate school now. He's in New Haven, so he's a Yalie. He's this sort of typical sort of male, sort of highly educated, eloquent, but even in there are sort of these odd moments of lack of eloquence, and increasingly, for example, he doesn't really finish his sentences. So you can see throughout the story how he gets more and more aggravated, that the woman who's interviewing him sort of doesn't believe him and is constantly sort of pushing back. So I think it's exactly that sort of type of character that he represents, who actually might have certain theoretical affinities. So if we're going to read the character in light of those affinities, we might end up saying, well, but apparently that's what the story supports. I would say that's actually what the story is trying to criticize. Yeah.
So this last question has reminded me, and I've like triple checked, so I know I'm not misquoting her, but she may have been playing devil's advocate. I remember a few years ago on the Wallace podcast, Claire Hayes-Brady was talking about this story, brief interview 20, and she hypothesized that perhaps we can read the fact that the story is really all about this man. It's all about him and what he claims to have learned from all of this, as effectively Wallace refusing to try to tell a story that isn't his to tell. And that story being that of a woman who's raped. Yeah. And I wonder what you make of that idea.
Yeah, I've talked with Claire about the project and about this this combined reading of The Press Person and Brief into number 20 with Dostoyevsky. I think, I mean, I also have sort of a similar idea in mind. I think I'm always a bit hesitant. It's just not the way. Sort of that's sort of not my, I guess, approach to literature. look, it seems from all the biographical evidence that Wallace in many ways was an asshole in real life. At the same time, the stories, he is the writer of the stories, he doesn't own them. There is, for me, sort of limited relevance into how it reflects his personal life. I think it's worthy of study. Of course, we should sort of look into that. I just don't think it's my forte necessarily. It's not what what my approach to these works usually is. So there is limited relevance to me to how this sort of reflects his own sort of personal life or personal struggles. But I think it is interesting that indeed there is an element to this, to how the story avoids the problem of him appropriating a voice that is not his to take, and how he actually maybe even channels aspects of his personal life. And I think this might partly be why he finds the story so personal, is that it's quite likely that there are aspects of his own behavior channeled into this interviewee, and that instead of writing a story about the woman, he writes a story about the man and his sort of inability, or maybe his behavior towards this woman. And that's the way to tell that story, and to, in a sense, also reveal that story sort of by proxy or via this sort of distance about the woman. So I think that's a really sort of interesting way of seeing his intention with how he set up that story. Yeah. I feel I've sort of repeated your question.
No, not really. No, you took it and ran in the good way.
Or
No, I didn't mean to suggest anything about.
I don't know anything about American football. Running backs they're good, right? They do good stuff.
They start from the back and they run. But no,
so they're important. Okay.
I wasn't trying to get at anything about personal life. I was more asking. Yeah, the question about sort of whose stories are whose to tell, and in what sense should we be trying to tell stories that aren't our own, but at what point does that become an appropriation or complete bastardization?
Yeah.
So
it seems like Wallace. I mean, we talked about this with the panel in the panel with Jane yesterday. This problem of appropriation. It seems to me that Wallace, in some ways, by all accounts, was maybe somewhat sort of overly paralyzed by that question. Right? That he very much stayed away from certain voices out of fear that he was not able to do that voice well, that he was appropriating something that he wasn't supposed to appropriate. Part of me thinks I would have liked to have seen him do that a little bit more and give it a go. I don't know, maybe I'm being insensitive when I say that, but there's variations, obviously. There are certain things that he could perhaps take on, and other things he should probably stay away from, as he did, and probably wisely. So, Vern, you wanted to...
I was just going to follow up really quickly. Does that have anything to do with the historical moment that he's writing in?
Yeah.
That there's a sort of expectation that he's coming on the backs of these male authors who have been criticized for trying to write women characters and doing it very badly. And so then there's this sort of generation, and I'm also thinking of Cormac McCarthy, who gets criticized for not writing women characters and women protagonists. And he says he's sort of part of that generation. He says, well, I don't feel qualified to write women characters. And I wonder if that has anything to do with that sort of historical moment as well. I don't know. It's just something I've wondered.
Yeah. No, it might very well be. Yeah. And I mean, obviously, Wallace does this whole thing with Updike, right? In that review. So he's very clearly concerned with that, and sort of decides, okay, I'm going to stay away from that, and maybe very much like Cormac McCarthy decides to stay away from that. Yeah.
Lunch is here.
Lunch is here. That's always a good reason to stop, I guess. Okay, thanks.